Hello, everyone. So on behalf of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston, it is a great pleasure to introduce this event. We have with us here a truly distinguished speaker from Duke University. And Professor Jehan Yüksel will be introducing him to us. Professor Yüksel works on the history of the Mamluks, the Ottoman Empire, and she also teaches broader Islamic themes. She is the author of an acclaimed book on the history of Ottoman Mamluk relations, and is currently working on multiple subjects relating to the history of Islamic empires. So it is my pleasure to introduce her. And Professor Yüksel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And of course, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Omid Safi to our audience. Professor Safi received his PhD from Duke University in 2000. He started his academic career at Colgate University, after which he moved to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He returned to his alma mater, where he currently holds the professorship in Sufism and contemporary Islam. Between 2014 and 19, he was also the director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center, one of the major hubs of research in the field. Safi is the former chair for the study of Islam at the American Academy of Religion. Well, I have been following Professor Omid Safi's prolific academic publication trajectory since 2006, when he published his first book with University of North Carolina Press, The Politics of Knowledge in Pre-Modern Islam, Negotiating Ideology and Religious Inquiry. In this important work on its Seljuk history, Dr. Safi brilliantly brings a new framework and approach to the history of Seljuks of Iran and Iraq. Before the publication of this monograph, that history was primarily read through the lens of political chronological narratives. And to tell the truth, actually, before the publication of this book, there wasn't a proper treatment of Seljuk history. It was mostly treated through articles and some surveys here and there. Dr. Safi took a different approach. In his own words, he sought, quote, to examine the interconnectedness of Seljuk political ideology and religious inquiry in pre-modern 11th and 12th century Iran and Iraq, end of quote. In 2009-10, he published Memories of Muhammad, which contextualizes the significance of Prophet Muhammad for the Muslims through studying crucial episodes of his life. His most recent book on Persian Sufism is Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition by Yale University Press. And his next book is on the classic Sufi Abul Hasan Kharaqani, followed by another book on the legacy of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. Dr. Safi leads spiritually oriented tours to Turkey and Morocco through Illuminated Tours, teaches courses on subjects ranging from Rumi to the broader history of Sufism through Illuminated Courses. However, I think besides his teaching, research, and academic publications, Dr. Safi also stands out with his engagement with current political and religious issues concerning the contemporary Muslim community. At a time, such a presence and engagement is sorely needed. My remarks are truly introductory in every sense of word, because I cannot exhaust Dr. Safi's contributions as a publicly engaged scholar and teacher. I want to acknowledge the support of Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at University of Houston that enables us to host Dr. Safi today. And I want to add a personal note, with your permission. I'm particularly grateful in this week of Thanksgiving that it is me who is introducing Dr. Safi, who will deliver his presentation entitled Path of Love in Islam, Rumi and His Ancestors, because my family comes from Konya, the city where Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi spent the majority of his adult life and where he was buried. Without further ado, I'm welcoming Dr. Safi.
Thank you very, very much, Fadi and Abdurazak and Jihan and Imran and all the friends who are here. In the Sufi tradition, one is sometimes told that you have to die before you die. And every time I get to give a talk, I have a little flavor of that, because it's kind of like going to my own funeral and hearing all the nice things that people are saying. And it makes me wonder who the heck this person is that they're describing in such kind and generous and loving ways. So thank you for giving me a little taste of the eulogies that we might receive someday, inshallah, and be worthy of them. So I am going to offer you this talk on Maulana Rumi and the Mazhab-e-Ishq, the path of love. And then feel free to type in your questions in the chat line, and we can also come back to them, inshallah, right afterwards. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this talk on Rumi and the path of radical love. We are going to be journeying through some of Rumi's own teachings, and also the figures who have shaped him into the zenith of Islamic spirituality that he is. I'm going to begin by sharing with you some of the ways in which Rumi has been represented in our popular culture. So the dominant tendency, perhaps, in seeing Rumi is to approach him as this universalist sage who stands beyond time and place. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are filled with thousands of quotes and memes and images traced back to Rumi, or at least attributed to Rumi, but in most cases it is all but impossible to find an original saying that is represented there. When the connection is somehow traceable, almost all the references to God, Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran have been erased. So the assertion of what you could call, as a shorthand, a New Age type of spirituality approach to Rumi is to detach him from the fertile spiritual soil of Islam in order to claim that he has a universal application. So one example here is Ivanka Trump, the daughter of the former president, quoting a poem that she identifies as the work of Rumi. Out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. She identifies Rumi as an Afghan poet. Okay. And the context is the developments in Afghanistan that her father, President Trump, had initiated. Nowhere is there a suggestion that Rumi was a Muslim, and a Persian-speaking Muslim, someone who, without a doubt, would have been barred from entering this country under her own father's policies. So on one hand, we have these kinds of New Age appropriations of Rumi, detaching him from Islam. Sometimes Muslims who want to insist on reclaiming and recovering Maulana, Rumi, have responded by citing this ubiquitous saying of Rumi, I am dust on the path of Muhammad, the chosen one. And اگر نقل کند جز این کس از گفتارم بیزارم از او. If anyone says other than this, then I loathe it and I loathe what they have had to say. So that response by many Muslims has been to say that Rumi represents, if you would, an Orthodox Muslim, and simply that. Well, what we are going to be exploring in this talk is something a little more subtle. Sure, Maulana is and was a lovingly devout Muslim. We know that he considers his own Masnavi arguably one of the most influential of all pieces of Islamic writing. as the Kashaful Quran, that which unveils the beauty of the Quran again and again and again. In his own lifetime, Maulana was considered to be Farzand Jan Mustafa, the offspring of the soul of the Prophet. So the analogy that I'm going to be using here is that of a mountain. To a certain extent, sure, we can consider, and many millions and hundreds of millions of Muslims have, considered Rumi to be, along with his near contemporary, Ibn Arabi, the two zenith points of Islamic spirituality. There's some suggestion that their lives might have overlapped in Anatolia, possibly. The way I like to approach Rumi is to consider him as something of a Mount Everest. Think of him as surely a zenith of Islamic spirituality, but you don't get to Everest without having the Himalayas around it. It is that vast mountain range which supports Everest and pushes and propels it to ever and ever higher heights. And likewise it is with Maulana Rumi. Behind him, around him, underneath him, are a whole series of sages and poets and lovers and dreamers that have been identified as following Mazhab-e-Ishq, the path of radical love, the school of radical love. And we're going to be exploring some of their teachings. One of the figures whose writings deeply informs Rumi is the extraordinary poet and Sufi Fariduddin Attar, whose mausoleum you see here. Rumi studied Attar very closely and patterned some of his own writings after him. Attar writes a book, Tazkiratul Awliya, the memoirs of the friends of God, which contains the tales of many of the Sufis who had come in the first 300 to 400 years of Islam. One of the Sufis that he quotes is an Egyptian figure named Dhul-Nun al-Misri, or in the Eastern pronunciation, Zul-Nun al-Misri. And Attar records Dhul-Nun as having had a visionary experience of God. This will give us a really good flavor of this school of radical love, both in Attar and later on in Rumi. So according to this dream that Dhul-Nun has, he imagines all the human beings who have ever been, who are, and shall forever be, to be gathered in the day of judgment before God. Then they hear the voice of God coming here to them and saying, "Who amongst you wishes to be free from all torment? No more pain, no more suffering, no more hellfire." People sort of look around and they're like, "Oh, no pain, no suffering. That sounds really good." So about 90% of them put up their hand. They wait for the catch, and there is no catch. The voice of God comes. "It shall be granted unto you. There will be no pain and no suffering for you." So quite happily, they leave. There's about 10% of the people left. They hear the voice of God come again. "Who amongst you would like to be granted my highest paradise, a garden so luminous that no eye has ever seen it and no word has ever described it?" So they look around and they're like, "Wow, that sounds really lovely. A garden so filled with light that no eye has ever seen it." So about 90% of them cautiously raise their hand. Again, they hear the voice of God, "It shall be granted unto you, and you may leave." So about 90% of those who are left end up leaving. And if you know this kind of storytelling, you know that things usually happen in waves of threes, and it's on the third wave that the truth is revealed. And so a third time they hear the voice of God, this time coming not so gentle, but like a thunder. I offered you redemption from hellfire, and I offered you the choice to live without any pain. You chose it not. I offered you the chance to be in my most luminous paradise, and you chose it not. What have you come here for? And Zulnoon, this sage, says that that handful of people who were left lower their head in humility, and they say, the one who asks knows better than we do. We did not come to be spared hellfire. We did not come to be granted the highest level of paradise. We came for you. And a third and final time they hear the voice of God, this time in the gentlest and the most merciful, saying, in that case, I am yours. So the path of love, Mazhab-e-Ishq, this school, if one understands that term loosely, this fragrance in the world of Islamic spirituality, which finds a zenith in the life and the being and the writings of Maulana Rumi, is about those lovers who are ultimately interested in God over and above mere salvation. This tradition goes back to many of the earlier Sufis. Of course, they trace themselves back to the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And as the Prophet ascends to paradise to see God face to face and chooses to return to humanity with the cry of Ummati, my people, that balance of a face-to-face encounter with God, with compassion for creation, so do the seekers and the lovers of Mazhab-e-Ishq. They each strive to have their own face-to-face encounter with the divine, combining that with compassion and love and care for humanity. Already before the time of Maulana Rumi, we have people like Sahl Tustari, who, when he was asked, what is the definition of this path? His response was to be at ease with God. To be at ease with God. And another mystic, like Shebli, says, how do you experience? He was asked, how do you experience God? And he said, the way that a baby does in her mama's lap. Like that feeling of safety and security in a home that a child, a toddler, experiences in that parental arm. So these kinds of sayings are, of course, building on that earlier interpretation, in fact, a hadith of the Blessed Prophet, that the divine qualities Rahman and Rahim, the all-compassionate and the all-merciful, are related in a metaphor to the word for Rahim, the womb, and both the Prophet and Ibn Arabi and other sages talk about it is as if, كأن, it is as if the totality of the universe is contained within the womb of God. So they're using a maternal image for the divine. It's as if God is pregnant with the cosmos. It is as if creation is the birth of the universe. And we could later, perhaps, talk about the ways in which even the prophet is described in very maternal and feminine ways. In fact, that's how poets like Jami, Abdurrahman Jami, understand that phrase, an-Nabiy al-Ummi, not to mean the illiterate prophet, astaghfirullah, or the unlettered prophet, but quite literally, an-Nabi al-Ummi, the maternal prophet, the prophet who loves you more than your own mama. So part of what we see going on in this Mazhab-e-Ishq is a balance between that aspect of transcendence, which never goes away, but it is complemented and reconciled with a tenderness, what people like Kharaqani will call a friendship, and indeed a relationship of love with the beloved. So that same Zulnun Masri, whom we already mentioned here, he has a saying that where he says, "Oh, my beloved, when I am in public, I call you Lord. But when we are alone, I call you as my beloved." So Lord and beloved combined. This path included many significant women and men, and perhaps none of them more famous than Rabia, the famous sage of Basra in today's Iraq. And so she has a famous prayer, which is featured so prominently in Attar and in the writings of Rumi. خداوندا اگر تو را از خوف دوزخ میپرستم در دوزخم بسوز. Oh Lord, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in that same hell. و اگر به امید بهشت میپرستم بر من حرام گردان. If I worship you hoping for paradise, make it forbidden for me. و اگر از پرای تو را میپرستم جمال باقی از من دریغ مدار. But if I worship you only for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty. Your everlasting beauty. In fact, the way that Rabia is usually represented is through this kind of an iconic image where she's running through the city with a lit torch in one hand and a vase or a bucket of water in the other hand, the juxtaposition of the two opposites. And people say, Rabia, what are you doing? And she says, I'm going to find heaven and hell, and with this torch, I'm going to burn it down. And with this vase, I'm going to quench the fires of hell so that people have no reason left to worship God other than God. It's tempting to just stay with Rabia for a little bit. There's another wonderful story. Of course, we see in many spiritual traditions and religious traditions, the famous words of Jesus come to mind as well. Knock and it shall be opened unto you, ask and it shall be granted unto you. Those kind of sayings are ubiquitous in many religious traditions. So Rabia is wandering down the street and there's a preacher seated on a pulpit, and he's preaching and he's paraphrasing these sayings. So there's a man who's saying, oh God, at long last, open a door for me. Rabia is walking by and she stops and she hears, and she pokes her head in and says, what did you say? And the man is perhaps a little disturbed that this woman is interrupting his majestic lecture. So he said, knock and it shall be opened, and God will open a door for you. And Rabia says, my friend, the door has never been closed. The door has never been closed. So this is a notion of an overflowing, abundant divine love that bypasses that language of gates and doors to an access to the divine, because the divine is already present. As some of these sages in the South Asian tradition say, God is closer to you than the ocean is to fish. So this is part of the matrix and the background that is shaping Maulana Rumi. And I want to introduce briefly two of the great ancestors, two of the Himalayan range of mountains who are propping up Maulana. The first one is Abul Hasan Kharaqani, and a simple shepherd who by his own admission only knew a few lines of the Quran, didn't know Arabic, never went to the madrasa, never studied anything. He wandered around in the desert, pouring out his heart to God. But we have such marvelous, marvelous sayings of him. We're told that because he had conquered his own ego, then all the beings around him were at peace with him, were in harmony with him. So we have sayings like this. When he's talking to God, he says the following: "My God, when my moment comes to leave this world, do not send the angel of death to take my soul. I will not give up the ghost to him. I didn't receive my soul from him, and I will not give it back to him. I received my soul from you and will surrender it to none other than you." And God, in response, carries out this intimate conversation, what in this tradition is called the Manageat, whispered prayers. So Kharaqani records that God Almighty said to me, "O my devotee, when you set out on the path, I am your path. When you get home, I am your host. When you speak, I listen. When you think, I know your thoughts. When you flee to me, I take hold of you. And when you are in awe of me, I comfort you. When you come to me in hope, I faithfully fulfill my promise. I am with you. You too be with me. When you thrive, I am with you. And when you are ruined and broken, I am with you." So this is that idea of a divine witness, that accompaniment, that fellowship, that friendship by God, with a hint that God is not only the God of the mountaintop, but also the God of the valley bottom. Here's an image of Kharaqani's old shrine. And naturally, just as the prophet ascends to see God face to face and returns to humanity out of compassion, so does Kharaqani's path also summon us to a notion of finding God with the weak and the vulnerable, the broken and the brokenhearted. So there's a famous story of Kharaqani that Attar and others have recorded. According to this tale, there were two brothers, and they had an elderly mother. The mother was weak and bedridden and required a lot of assistance. The two brothers had a very different style, a very different orientation. One brother devoted himself morning, noon, and night to prayer and to the extra prayers that were necessary. The other brother might have done the required prayers, but he devoted himself above all else to taking care of their mother. Mama, can I get you some water? Mama, can I get you something to eat? He would keep a vigil by the mother at nighttime. Mama, can I walk you to the bathroom? Then one night, the brother, whom we'll just call the praying brother, has a visionary experience of God, in which God tells him, Mubarak, Mazel Tov, congratulations. For the sake of your brother, I have decided to forgive both of your sins and admit both of you to my paradise. And the praying brother says, oh my God, you can't imagine how long I've been waiting to have this dream of you and to hear your voice. But my Lord, you're clearly mistaken. I think what you mean to say, God, is that for my sake and for the sake of all of my prayers, you are forgiving my brother. He doesn't pray as much as I do. And God responds with that ultimate mic drop moment. No, I'm pretty clear that I know who I'm speaking to. But you see, all those prayers that you did for me, I had no need of. But your mama needs you. And that's the end of the story. Your mama needs you. Right? There is this being summoned to show the love for God through compassion for creation. And a compassion that, as Rumi would say, like water, always flows down towards the weak and the vulnerable. That's what Rumi calls pure love. So this is the poem that has been inscribed in Kharaqani's shrine. Whoever comes here, feed them. Give them their daily bread. Feed them, but don't ask them about their faith. Don't ask them what religion they are. If they were worthy of receiving a John, a soul, a life force, in the court of God Almighty, surely in our little humble spread here, they're worthy of receiving some bread. So there's that notion that this compassion is one that overflows beyond the boundaries of race and ethnicity and even religion. The other sage whom we want to explore as one of the mountains who is propping up Maulana Rumi is Ahmad Ghazali. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he's the younger brother of the much more famous Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali, arguably the most influential Sunni thinker in the history of Islam. When the elder Ghazali has his famed spiritual crisis and runs away, how do I know anything is real? It is the younger Ahmad who takes over for his brother, teaches all of his classes, looks after his wife and his brother's children. So this was not a marginal tradition. This is someone that has the highest position in the land. And in this miniature, you see him seated across from his main disciple, his brilliant student, Ain al-Qazat Hamedani. We may come back to him also. So what is it that Ahmad Ghazali says? He writes the first book in the Persian tradition on ishq, on radical love. And Maulana Rumi says about Ahmad Ghazali, Imam Ghazali, Muhammad Ghazali is a great mountain. He is a phenomenal scholar. But it would have been better if he had focused on ishq the way that Ahmad does. He would have revealed the secret of being close to God in this Muhammadi way, the way that Ahmad does. So Maulana is much closer to the teachings of Ahmad Ghazali than he is to Muhammad Ghazali. Up until the time of Ahmad Ghazali, Muslim thinkers generally made a distinction about two kinds of love. The love for God, which they saw as real love, ishq haqiqi, and the love that we share amongst us, which they call ishq majazi, metaphorical love. All of these go back to a Quranic verse in which yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbunahum, God will bring forth a people whom God will love, and they love God. And a lot of the Sufi tradition is a commentary on this one verse of the Quran. How is God's love and our love related to one another? Well, here's the answer that Ahmad Ghazali gives us. When he agrees to write this book, Savaneh, which is translated into English, He said, fine, I'll write you a book on Ishq, on radical love, on one condition, that you do not restrict it, na be khaliq wa na be makhluq, not to the creator only and not to the creation only, that love is one. There's one love. So in the Mazhab Ishq, we get this brilliant insight that talks about Ishq, radical love, not as being a human sentiment, right? This is the greatest mistake that in much of our contemporary world we make about love. We have collapsed and reduced love into that narrow band of romantic, physical, and even sexual love. No, love is much more expansive. This is a much more generous notion of love. For the Mazhab Ishq, love is something fundamentally divine. It springs forth out of the divine being, brings creation into existence, sustains us here. And if we can just get over our ego, our nafs, for one breath, we could merge back into this cosmic current of love and flow back with it towards the divine. So in another chapter of the Savaneh, Ahmad Ghazali says that that word yuhibbuhum, God loves them, from the Quran, the letter B contains a nuqta, a dot under it. If the dot of the B of yuhibbuhum is planted in the fertile soil of and they love God, yuhibbunahu, then this dot will become a seed and will give rise as a beautiful flower in us. And then you will see that the flower is hamrang, the same color, the same nature, the same essence as the seed. So in other words, that expression of ishq in humanity, if it's pure, it will be of the same essence, the same color as that seed of divine love that has been planted in us. And in the first chapter, after he introduces the notion of the reference to the yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbunahu, he gives a notion that it was love that crossed over on the steed, which is our spirit, from non-existence into being. Thus, the night of union, Chirag Vasl, will always be lit and illuminated in the nighttime. It's an erotic language of the lover and the beloved also being joined together. From that wine, which is unforbidden in our madhab, right? So intoxication is a powerful Sufi metaphor. We're told that even in paradise, one of the rivers of paradise, the fountains of paradise, is going to be wine along with water and milk and honey. From that wine, which is unforbidden in our path. So we're not talking about the wine of grape, we're talking about the wine of love, the intoxication of love. Until we return to God, you will never find our lips dry. So this is the context of Ahmad Ghazali. And now we're going to take a look at some of the ways in which this material shows up in Mazhab Ishq. His student Ain al-Quzat takes that notion, fleshes it out. He provides all the references to the Quran and the Hadith tradition of the beloved Prophet, in particular the Hadith Qudsi tradition. It is Ain al-Quzat who specifically talks about the path of love being one that enriches and deepens and invigorates the legal schools. So he says that, some people follow the madhab of Imam Shafi'i or Imam Abu Hanifa. It might be Shafi'is or Hanafis or Malikis or Hanbalis, and in the Shia tradition, Jafaris. But he says, we too have a madhab, we too have a school, we too have a path. Our path is the mazhab ishq, the path of love, which is the path of God. So those other paths are named after a jurist. Our path, he says, is God's own path. All of this is the background that is shaping and informing Maulana Rumi. So how is he developing this tradition? How is he elaborating on it? To begin with, we see that his understanding of ishq, of love, is again not a mere human emotion. He says at one point, Zade ast mara madar ishq az awwal. It is mother love, mother ishq, that gave birth to me in the beginning. Right? We are born out of love. And he immediately identifies ishq with the path of the Prophet Muhammad. Ishq ast tariq u rah peygambar ma. Ma zade ishq va ishq shod madar ma. Love is the tariqah is the path of our Prophet, our messenger. We are born of love, and love is our mother. He goes on and he provides material that very much talks about ishq as almost something akin to the logos in the Johannine Christian tradition. So we're not talking about a mere human emotion here. Man ke basham bad و خاک و آب و آتش مست اوست. آتش او تا چه آرد بر من و بر خاک و باد. عشق از او آبستن است و این چار از عشق او. این جهان زین چار زاد و این چار از عشق زاد. Who am I? And then he names the four elements, which have been shared in so many traditions: earth and water and fire and air. All of these four are drunk with God. Look at what God's fire, love, is doing to me and to the earth and to the air. Love is pregnant with God, and these four elements have come from love. So everything that you see in this world is born from those four elements, and these four elements are created through ishq, through love. So love is really that intermediary, that kalima, that logos that is bringing the world into creation. And like many other sages, Rumi is not interested in writing a treatise on ishq. He doesn't want a systematic philosophical discourse. This is that world of mythopoesis. It's a mythopoetic world in which poetry might be as close as we can get to appreciating it. So here's a very famous poem of Maulana in which he comes to identify ishq as something divine. Man ghulam qamaram, ghayr qamar hich magu. By the way, all of these translations are from that book of mine, Radical Love. So you could find these translations there. I serve that moon-like beauty. Say nothing to me unless it's about her. دوش دیوانه شدم عشق مرا دید و بگفت آمدم نعره مزن جام مدر هیچ مگو. So he has a visionary experience of love. Last night I became love crazed. Love saw me and said, I've come. Don't shout. Say nothing. And Rumi says, I've tried this love thing before and I got hurt real bad. گفتم ای عشق من از چیز دیگر میترسم. گفت آن چیز دیگر نیست. دیگر هیچ مگو. I said, love, I'm afraid of something else. Love said, there is nothing else. say nothing, right? So this is an almost Akbarian kind of language, whereas in an Akbarian context, you might say, "Wala mawjood illallah." There's nothing in existence except for Allah. Here, you would say, there is nothing other than ishq. It's a reminder of the hikam of Ibn Ata'Allah. In the beginning, there was Allah, and there was nothing with Allah. In the end, there will be Allah, and there will be nothing with Allah. And then they add, and it is now, as it shall be then. So whether you're using the language of wujud, existence, or nur in the Ashraqi tradition, light, or in Rumi's tradition, in the Mazhab Ishq tradition, love, there is nothing other than love. And then Rumi's trying to figure out, what is this? Who is this beautiful being? Are you human? Are you an angel? Are you a jinn? گفتم این روی فرشته است عجب یا بشر است. گفت این غیر فرشته است و بشر هیچ مگو. I said, what a beauty. Are you an angel? Are you human? Love said, no, not an angel, not a human. Say nothing. And then the narrator is freaking out at this point. Well, if you're not human, and you're not a jinn, and you're not an angel, that just leaves. I said, what is this? Say it. Love said, shh, stay like this. Say nothing. گفتم ای دل پدری کن نه که این وصف خداست. گفت این هست ولی جان پدر هیچ مگو. I said, my heart, aren't you describing God? Love said, yes, my child, but hush, say nothing. So there is that notion, that reminder in Rumi's tradition that ishq is identified with God himself, herself, and that the words can take you to the threshold, but then there's a silence, which is not the absence of words, but the receptivity in which one receives the divine. This notion of identifying love with God is one that would be transmitted later on in the Mazhab Ishq, in the path of love. We see figures like Shah Ne'matullah Wali, who is the founder of the most important Shi'i Sufi tariqa, who says, Ma'shuq o ishq o ashiq bashad yeki va senam. Love, lover, and the beloved are one, though they are called by three names. So you could almost come to think of this, consider this as a type of a trinity in a Sufi context. And many Sufis, Rumi himself included, go on to explore the fact of what a mystery this is, since the lover, the human, has gone into fana, has knotted themselves, negated themselves. So who is left if the lover has written themselves out of the story? Fakhreddin Iraqi, one of the students of both Rumi and Ibn Arabi, says the following: if I have become wholly the beloved, who is this lover? Love, lover, and beloved are all one. Being one, there's no room here for union. What use to speak of separation? So even putting aside that language of union and separation, we've seen that in the case of the Mi'raj, the prophet goes and has this face-to-face encounter with God. And of course, that's the same language that Rumi uses to speak about the experience of ishq. And so he says, radical love, ishq, is a mi'raj, is an ascension, taking us to the roof to rendezvous with the Sultan of beauty, with God. God is beautiful and God loves beauty. Read on a lover's face the tale of this rising. The saying of the Prophet, the hadith of the Prophet, identifies the salat, the namaz, the daily prayers as the mi'raj of the faithful. Rumi uses the language that ishq is our mi'raj, in a sense identifying the prayers, something which Rumi observed devoutly and lovingly, with a mi'raj itself. And just as we have been yearning after God, God is also yearning after us. So in one of his poems, Maulana Rumi uses a metaphor, which of course we also find in the Zen tradition. No lover would seek union if the beloved were not seeking her. When the lightning bolt of love for the friend, and they call God Doost, or the friend, has shot into this heart, know this: there's also love in that heart. When love for God dabbles in your heart, have no doubt, God also loves you. Have you ever heard the sound of one-handed clapping? Right, that famous metaphor, koan. Have you ever heard the sound of one-handed clapping? A thirsty man moans, oh, precious water. The water also moans, who wants to drink me? So if we thirst after God, this is an echo of God yearning after us. Kharaqani had already said that when he gets to about 60 years old, he tells God, he calls on God, oh, my Lord, I have been seeking after you for 60 years, only to hear the voice of God calling back to him. I have been seeking you since before there was a thing called time and space. As we saw with Kharaqani, the love of God, love for God, shows up as compassion towards all. And we see this in many of the anecdotes of the life of Rumi. We're fortunate to have about 800 pages of stories of Rumi's life. We're told that once there was a Christian monk who traveled from Constantinople, not yet Istanbul, to come and see Maulana in Konya. And he arrives and he asks where Maulana is, and he wonders, and out of respect, his life has been so enriched by Maulana that he sees Maulana and he bows down. He says, I went to stand up and start talking with him, and I saw that Maulana was still bowing down to him. And so the monk says, I went back down. And I stayed down for a few seconds, and then I got back up to start talking, and I saw that he was still bowing down to me. And the monk says, 33 times I went down, and 33 times I got up to start talking, and I saw that he was still bowing down before me. And eventually the monk rips his shirt. This is like the medieval demonstration of, I can't take this anymore. And he says, where do you find this humility? And he categorizes himself in this way. Am I not, to some of you, an infidel? I'm not even a Muslim. And Maulana simply responds, this is the way of our Sultan, meaning this is the way of the Prophet. God has blessed you with a soul. If I do not show this love to you, to whom would I show it? And since this is a Rumi story, the monk becomes a Muslim and joins the circle of Rumi. I want to conclude with two last images, and we will come back perhaps in some conversations in the future about the insights that Rumi has in his poetry. But if you go to Rumi's shrine today in the city of Konya, and I have the great blessing of having taken about 1,000 people there over the years on our Illuminated Tours programs, as you're about to enter the shrine and to pay your respects to the sarcophagus of Rumi, Ya Hazrat Maulana, or the person in whom we detect the presence of God, you see this poem written, Ka'batul Ushaq Bashad in Maqam. This place is like a Kaaba for the lovers of God. Harikin naqis amad inja shud tamam. Everyone comes here broken down and incomplete. May all leave whole. So there's already this recognition, this invitation that you come on this path, not because you're already fully illuminated, not because you're already perfect, but precisely because you're broken and incomplete. This is the story of Shams Tabrizi, Rumi's beloved mentor, that on the day of judgment, he will be able to bring the one thing that God is missing, God is lacking, and that's need, that's dependence. So come and join and bring your brokenness, bring your vulnerability, bring your incompleteness, because that's the one thing that God is missing. There's a wonderful story from Rumi's life that the king of Konya, Parvane, once said, I love me some Rumi. It's just all the riffraff around him that I can't stand. They're rude, they're mean, they're ugly, and they're not refined. They're lacking in adab, that ultimate Muslim virtue. And this breaks the hearts of all of his companions. And Rumi finally says, he writes a letter to the Parvane and says, everything you say about them is true. They are rude, they are mean, they are ugly, they're lacking in refinement. This is why I took them on as my students. If they had already been beautiful, I myself would have become their student. So this is a path, a school, not for the already illuminated, but for the broken and the brokenhearted, for the unrefined. And I think in the interest of time, we're going to pause here. I think what I would like to just end with is that we began by noting that there is a tendency among a certain New Agey appropriation of Maulana Rumi to claim Rumi out of his Persian Muslim Sufi context, to strip away the language of God and the Quran and the Prophet and Islam. And surely one has to address that and correct it. I think there's an equal component that one also should address, which is that it is not simply that the Islam has been taken out of Rumi, but to a large extent, in many, far too many contemporary Muslim circles, it is the Rumi and everything that Rumi represents, this aspect of Islam which is at once poetic and imaginative and sensual and mystical and spiritual, that has been taken out of Islam. And I think for those of us who are lovers and students and dreamers in this path of love, the restoration of that dimension of ihsan, that dimension of realizing beauty into the fullness of our tradition, is something that we would do well to devote our life to. So thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to sharing some more of Rumi's teachings with you in the future.
So thank you very much, Professor Safi, for this literally illuminating talk. And now we're going to have some thoughts on it and a commentary on it by our expert in early Islamic history, Professor Imran Badawi. Professor Badawi is the chair of the Modern Classical Languages Department at the University of Houston. He also directs the Arab Studies program here, and he has written notable studies on the Quran, amongst various other themes. So, Professor Badawi, it is a pleasure to hear you comment on Professor Safi. I look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Professor Takriti, Professor Yüksel, of course, Mr. Kafiti as well, and of course, our speaker, Professor Omid Safi. I wish we could have done this in person. It would have been, I think, a lot more fun. I think that I would be remiss not to mention that I think even the subject matter is something that can help alleviate a lot of the suffering and pain that you said we carry, I think, nowadays, even in COVID and increasingly in isolation. I have 3 pages of notes. I will try and say it a little bit and just try and stick within the time limit. So Professor Safi, of course, has offered here a tour de force, a gentle tour de force of Rumi and his predecessors. He has spoken, of course, about Rumi as a universalist sage, and the ubiquitous as well as problematic qualities, namely the sanitization of many of his verses, which are embedded within an Islamic civilization and within an Islamic context, which is, of course, removed. Professor Safi also spoke about the sage, or Rumi, and others as a mountain, and one, of course, that belongs to a series of mountains or a mountain range. And this kind of terminology and imagery, of course, we see, you find it in biblical language, you find it in East Asian traditions as well, as the speaker referred to. And he also referred to, of course, a plethora, an abundance of predecessors, which I know, there's even more, but I was struggling to, of course, keep up. And there are so many incredible names, including Attar al-Nuni al-Misri, who I'm biased towards because I have Egyptian origin, Tustari Shibli, Jamia, and others, of course. If I can maybe even add that the genealogy of Rumi is one that is demonstrated to be incredibly rich, and it involves ethnically Persian, Arab, I would say even, Christian, Buddhist, all sorts of people. Rabia, of course, Al-Adawi or Rabia al-Basra is a towering figure and someone who I'm also exploring on my own. And I would also, offer the speaker and add even another name we have within the Syriac, the Eastern churches of the Syrian Orthodox Church, Isaac the Syrian, or Isaac of Nineveh, who has a very similar sort of vibe when it comes to speaking about love. And in Syriac and in Arabic, love, of course, there's so many valences to love, and I do not pretend to even know. But of course, the idea of burning passion and a burning fire comes to mind. This is something that we shared within both traditions. I very much appreciated, of course, hearing and learning a lot about Kharaqani and Ahmad al-Ghazali, the younger brother of the Ghazali. I spend a lot of time talking about Abu Hamid, of course, or Muhammad al-Ghazali, the famous one who ran away from home and left his wife and kids. But I'm learning, of course, I actually didn't know that it was Ahmad al-Ghazali who took care. So there is a historical aspect to the mystics as well, as really not just preaching love and care and compassion, but actually practicing it as well. So your mama needs you. And I'm also attentive to our speaker's choice of language and dialect, and that these mantras and lessons are in fact perennial. You find them within the Sufi and even Persian sages. You find echoes of them in the Hadith literature, in the Quran, in the Eastern churches, in the Zen tradition, and the idea again that service, or in some cases even love, compassion, sort of trumps salvation or prayer, or more regimented forms of getting to the divine. Shams Tabriz, of course, I thought I would hear more about the sort of wild mentor I think that's the John the Baptist figure of the Jesus, right? Anyway, I'm sure our speaker can come back and correct me if he feels. A couple of other things I found interesting. Some of the language here I found, and it's not just here, of course, but the language that we find within the Persian poetry and Rumi and others, it tends to be sexual. It alludes to sexual language, and in some cases even pregnancy and birth. This is what we heard again from our speaker. And I was very pleased that Professor Safi referred to a trinity, and that Rumi, of course, referred to it as a mystery. I was actually learning that as he spoke, because this is precisely what was coming to my mind. And again, I'd say this only because of the opportunity to build bridges and to look at how these genealogies, the Christian, the Muslim, the Buddhist, and these geographical boundaries are all sort of, they sort of melt into the distance through Rumi, who really is fascinating. It is also interesting to find the lover, and the beloved, those aspects of the Trinity, to be one, right? It is, you have the same sort of mathematical problem, but it's of course a beautiful one, and they're unified by fana, which is again, as I think our speaker mentioned, as being as not, or as sort of this nullification of the self, which again has of course tendencies that we see in Buddhism and so on and so forth. One thing about the word ishq, if I think about this, is of course myself going to my philological and historical roots. Ishq in some old Arabic circles, and certainly within Aramaic language, is sexual. So I'm interested also to know more, and to explore together, hear more, from you. So there's again, the one could write books on love. I would not be qualified, but our speaker would be, and we would still have more to explore. Anyway, I'm going to try and also wrap up my disparate ideas here, and pose for our speaker and for everyone else, of course, that is the case of Rumi and his predecessors, one similar to that of the Bodhisattva, where you're able to access God, but you sort of stop and say, no, you know what, I have to help my mama. Is the case of Rumi also one where we can build bridges today? I would imagine the speaker would agree with me. And how do we do that? Especially in, as Professor Safi mentioned, the sort of new age culture. And I would say also, what do we do with the mantra that especially Generation Y, Generation Z proposed to all of us of, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, right? So these are all thoughts and questions in great appreciation of you, Professor Safi. Thank you so much for being with us today. And
thank you very much, Dr. Badawi, for these important comments. I think, Professor Safi, would you like to reflect on Professor Badawi's comments now? Or
I think, Imran raises some really wonderful points. I like the tree metaphor that, we live in a part of the country where we've got old trees, ancient trees, trees that were alive before there was a country called the United States of America. And in some cases, trees that were probably older than Columbus's colonial journey. And those trees are quite deeply rooted, and then they open up and they provide shade and fruit far beyond their immediate roots, or what in the South we would call roots. And I think that's a good model, is that, someone like a Rumi, yes, he calls his masterpiece Kashaf al-Quran, the unveiler of the Quran. That's an erotic metaphor right there. Kashaf al-Quran is tied to that notion of reading the Quran, making love to the Quran by unveiling the bride of the Quran, to use that famous metaphor from Rumi's Fihi ma Fihi. You don't read the book, you make love to the word of God. And there's an erotic union. And that whole language of lover and the beloved becoming one, how can that be anything but a sensual language, an erotic language? There's a lot that has been written about the whole notion of the shahid, the beautiful beloved, someone whose beauty cannot help but remind you of the beauty of God, and that the shahid and the shahada sort of go on hand in hand. And this is beyond the scope of this little short presentation, but there's a whole lot that one can do about the fact that for Rumi circle, the shahid, the beautiful, was without a doubt someone who could take the form of either the male or the female. And so there's a whole notion of the male human being being beautiful and the female human being being beautiful. The dispute at that time was the then what? And what does one do with that beautiful and perhaps alluring form of the body? I think granting and allowing for the fact that Rumi has this intimate connection with the Prophet and with the Quran, when all of these early Muslim sages, I think one important and powerful bridge in the direction that Imran was indicating is for us to remember that there has never been, and there is not now, and unless we have a genocidal future, there will never be in the future, a world in which Muslims lived in civilizational isolation. So where Rumi came from, the Khurasan region, was a part of the world deeply informed by Buddhism. And therefore, it's not an accident that many of the Sufi stories, take the case of Ibrahim Adham, right? The Ibrahim Adham story is a paraphrasing of the Buddha story. And so are many of the stories that had come through a combination of Indian and South Asian tales, such as the elephant in the city of the blind men, right? We've seen these stories before. We know that there were Buddhist monasteries in Persia as far west as Tabriz, where Shams comes from, up until the 15th century. And in Konya, where our dear friend Jihan's family hails from, it was a very cosmopolitan society. Yes, Maulana, whatever you want to think of these silly modernistic terms like national identity, he was a Persian speaker living under the Anatolian Seljuk Rum, Turkish rule. Perhaps the majority of the town were Greek speakers at that time. They're Arabs, they're Jews, they're Kurds, they're Armenians, and all of these show up as characters in his life story. And you got some really amazing accounts of Rumi going to meditate in caves with Christian monks. What did they do? What did they experience? We're just given hints of it. What we are told is that when Rumi's funeral comes and his body is being carried to the cemetery, that the Christians are also lining up behind the procession. And the Sultan of Konya is quite puzzled, and he calls the head of the Christians over and he says, well, you know, he's one of us. What are you guys doing here? And their response, I think, is quite revealing. Mind you, they stay Christians, but their response is, up until we saw him, we could have never imagined someone that we would think of calling the second Jesus. Because by looking at him, we understood the love that for us, Jesus embodies. That's a really revealing and rich example where a Muslim spiritual giant who's called the offspring of the soul of the Prophet can have friendship with Christian monks and be mourned by people who adore him, admire him, learn from him, without necessarily feeling, as that monk in the 33 times bowing story did, of changing their religious identity. And I think these kinds of stories and anecdotes are important. Whatever one takes to be the historicity of these accounts in a positivistic way, they're pedagogically really important, and they're important, obviously, for people in that time period. And lastly, in terms of what does one do with the sort of New Agey appropriation of Rumi, I think I try to indicate that I think a lot of the work is actually by going back, for those of us who identify as Muslim, to our own tradition and reinvigorating it with the qualities of love and beauty and mercy and poetry and imagination and subtlety. And as far as everything else goes, and what does one do about the New Agey part of it, it's to remember that on one hand, we do live, as Brother West and others have been reminding us, we live in a marketized world where it seems like everybody and everything is up for sale. And the commercialization of spirituality is a fact. So what is it that I think Rumi's tradition has to offer us as a corrective against that tradition is that the goal of a vibrant spiritual life, and even the I'm spiritual, not religious approach, is on one hand to respond with mercy by saying that, well, that religiosity that you have rejected, that cardboard religiosity perhaps deserves to be rejected and replaced with something that is richer and more robust and more imaginative. And on the other hand, the goal of a spiritual life isn't simply your happiness. You're not here to become a spiritual junkie and have mystical experience. Any spiritual path worth its salt also insists on ritual, community, discipline, transformation. And unless the same spiritual path that is singing ecstatically about the love of God and the love of humanity is also talking about the ability to hold up a mirror in front of oneself and figure out how to polish the mirror of the heart, then it's, I forget which pill it is, the purple pill or the red pill or the blue pill from one of them is Matrix and one of them is Viagra. I forget which one is which. But, and that's not the goal. I think that it has to include that element of transformation and that polishing.
Yes, Professor Safi, the questions will be managed by our Assistant Director, Fadi Qafaiti. And I believe we have a question, Fadi, from Mr. Latif Adnan, who is, I know, is very deeply read in the Sufi tradition and is one of my favorite intellectuals in Houston.
Thank you, Dr. Omar, for this enlightening lecture. I'm going to go straight to the question, which is the issue of the appropriation of mystical Islam by theological Islam, which has been going on from the beginning of Sufism in Islam. And that actually caught my attention with the story of the man who was taking care of his mother. As we know in mystical Islam, and also Sunni Islam, we have the figure of Uwais al-Qarni, that Sufi from Yemen, that the Sunnis said he never come and participate in none of these ghazawat or campaign with the Prophet because he was taking care of his mother. But also we know Uwais al-Qarni as a Sufi man that was looked for by Umar and Ali when they were looking for him and all that. And even Claude Addas, she come up with the terminology, which is Uwaisiya, or what is called self-taught Sufism. And if you can elaborate a little bit about the figure of Uwais al-Qarni in this context of teaching of Rumi and all that tradition. Also, my question is, what are the traces of Rumi in this crossover experience between mystical Islam and theological Islam? Or is the case of the Zawaya in Morocco, mostly in the Bouchishi movement and all that? I mean, where we can see there is a lot of Maliki teaching there, a lot of Sunni teaching, but in the meantime, it remains also faithful to the Sufi tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question, and I appreciate it very much. So there's two parts, I think, to your beautiful question. And on the first part, I oftentimes try to caution us against bifurcating and dividing up the vast realm of Islamic thought into these distinct realms, as if there is a legal Islam and a theological Islam and a philosophical Islam and a Sufi Islam that somehow never touch. So remember that Maulana Rumi himself is a madrasa scholar. So at the time of Maulana, we're told that there might have been dozens and dozens of madrasas in Konya. There's two of them today, the Karatai Madrasa and the Injaminara Madrasa, that still survive in Konya. It's possible Maulana might have taught in one of them. So in his daytime, he's a scholar of hadith, he's a scholar of Islamic law. In the nighttime, he is composing poetry and leading a Sufi majlis. That is very much the same model as what we find with Ahmad Ghazali. As Imran mentioned, when Muhammad Ghazali, Abu Hamid Ghazali, as he's called in the Arab tradition, has his famous spiritual crisis, he is the most distinguished professor in probably the most famous university network in the world at that time, the Nizamiya Madrasa system. Students have come from all over the world to study with Imam Ghazali. What are they going to do when Imam Ghazali runs away to Mecca and to Jerusalem and elsewhere? Ahmad takes over. So in the daytime, Ahmad is teaching the courses in a madrasa, and in the nighttime, he's composing the first book that we have on Ishq, and taking part of these Sufi sessions. I think what you tend to find in Maulana's tradition is not so much a dismissing of the legal tradition. But what he does do is, in our world, in the 21st century, religion is to some extent a matter of personal choice. If you want to pray, pray. If you don't want to pray, don't pray. If you want to fast, fast. If you don't want to fast, don't fast. That wasn't the same way in the 13th century. There was a lot of social capital around the public observation of religion. And therefore, the concern that the Sufis and others always had was hypocrisy. Who are the people who are actually performing the prayers and fasting and doing all the righteous things publicly because they are in love with the beloved? And who are the ones who are there in order to be seen and thought of as pious? So what you tend to find in Maulana's language, and this continues after him through people like Hafiz and others, isn't so much a critique of the law, but you could call it a critique of empty ritualism, when the rituals have been detached from their meaning and their intention and the beauty. And in that context is when the same Maulana, who is a daytime master of the legal tradition and teaching in a madrasa, he's got these sharp lines. And mind you, he himself coming out of a Shafi'i tradition, Hanafi tradition, his beloved Shams coming from a Shafi'i tradition. These are the two dominant Sunni traditions legally at his time. And Maulana has a line in which, and more than once, in which he says, Abu Hanifa teaches us nothing about Ishq, and Imam Shafi'i doesn't contain any narrations about Ishq. So a master of law can critique the very school of which he's the master in order to call us to rise beyond mere ritualism. I think that's one of the aspects to think about. But ritualism resonated very differently in a fundamentally religious society, whether the people were Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or what have you. And I think very briefly, just so we have time to get to the other questions, of course, in Morocco, there's a deep, deep Sufi tradition. Morocco is a place that is also very dear to my heart. Other than Turkey, we also have been, alhamdulillah, taking people to Morocco on our Illuminated tours. And Morocco is a profoundly Ahl Bayti society, the whole Shurafa tradition. It's an Ahl Bayt loving tradition. So it's an Ahl Bayt loving tradition without being Shia per se, in much the same way that many parts of the Muslim world were up until 1850 or so. Whether it's the love for Imam Hussein in Cairo, or the commemoration of Ashura in Turkey, or every Qawwali session beginning with Man kuntu mawlahu fa aliyun mawlahu. So there was a ubiquitous love for the family of the Prophet, which was shared across the world beyond Shia and Sunni sectarian lines, that unfortunately in the last 150 years or so has become more marginalized. And if we had more time, I would love to share maybe some of the stories that Maulana and Kharaqani and others share about the Prophet, but that might just have to wait till another occasion.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have a question from one of our PhD students, Ibrahim Badsha.
Thank you so much, Professor Safi, for this illuminated lecture. I've been constantly having like goosebumps listening to you, and I really loved it. And I wish if we had like a in-person session where we would be talking more. Anyway, I love the way you synthesized the like two aspects, like theology and like absolute like love, and like the way Sharia and Tariqa are like combined in Islamic tradition, and like how now we see them as like two distinct things. And I love the way you synthesize them and like you connect them, because as far as my understanding goes, the origin of Sufism is like al-ihsan, like anta abdullah kannaka tara. So that is like you worship Allah as you see him, and like that's how you interact. You can like make love in like more radical sense. So I love the way you've been synthesizing these like two aspects of Islam. My question is, I actually read your like comments on Coleman Bach's translation of Rumi and how like Islam is erased. I read it in Rosina Ali's article, and I wanted to know which translation we can trust in like of Rumi's poetry, because I don't speak Persian and I badly want to find a trustworthy translation of Rumi. So I've been looking for one, but I couldn't find one. And also another question is, you mentioned Hikam, Ibn Tayla Iskandari's Hikam, and I kind of find it like it's how we can connect it with like radical love or like that sort of, because in Hikam I find it more like there is a clear servant-God relationship than like a lover-beloved relationship, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to know how, like I love Hikam. I kind of like I read it a lot whenever I feel like hopeless, or like when I need to have like some sort of faith in anything, I go back to Hikam. But I want to know like how Hikam brings this aspect of lover, beloved forward to the readers.
I should note, Professor Safi, that Ibrahim is a distinguished translator from Arabic to Malayalam. That might explain also his interest in the translational aspect. And he's doing a wonderful PhD here. He can tell you about it later on some other time. But yeah, please go ahead.
Mashallah, mashallah, wonderful. May God bless you in your work and in this kind of translation, which of course has always characterized so much of the Islamic civilization, and from Arabic to Persian to Turkish to Urdu to Wolof, Malay, other languages as well. So I think to begin with, it's always helpful to remember that just as we don't want to be making binaries out of theological, legal, mystical, philosophical models of Islam, every Sufi path also has its own flavor. And so if you go to, for example, a traditional Naqshbandi kind of a context, and you attend their dhikr sessions, well, then Naqshbandis, at least the majoritarian tradition, is the only one that traces itself to the being of the Prophet, not through Imam Ali, but through Hazrat Abu Bakr, may peace be upon them both. And therefore, emulating the experience of the Prophet with Abu Bakr in the cave, their zikr is a purely silent zikr. And so they tend to differentiate their zikr from the more perhaps ecstatic, verbalized forms that you would get elsewhere. That observation at the realm of practice is also one that you can apply to the level of teachings as well. So the language and the emphasis on ishq, obviously, contrary to what my beloved Iranian friends might assert, the Iranians did not invent ishq any more than they invented God or sunshine or poetry. But ishq did become, in some ways, a fundamental character of the majority of the Persian poetic mystical tradition. And then through Persian to Turkish and Urdu as the two dominant tradition in which, the Turkish Sufis and the South Asian Sufis and beyond Urdu to other South Asian vernaculars, they're always kind of looking back over the Persian classics of Maulana and Sadi and Hafiz and what have you. So I think we want to preserve the particularity of the Arabic tradition. Having said that, and there's some really good writing, and Cyrus Zargar's book here on Sufi aesthetics, I think, is a really good one that points out the ways in which some of the tropes and the teachings and metaphors of the Mazhab-e-Ishq, the path of radical love, also shows up in Arabic in figures like Ibn al-Farid. I think Ibn al-Farid is probably the closest Arab tradition exponent of the Mazhab-e-Ishq. And while he's not a formal part of the school, certain aspects of Ibn Arabi, and in particular the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, which Michael Sales has done a new and wonderful translation of. But the one comment that I make, and I always feel like I have to sort of say this, particularly to our Iranian and Turkish friends, is that the vast majority of pre-modern Muslim intellectuals and poets and Sufis were multilingual. They were never monolingual. And we see this in Rumi's writings himself. Yes, 98% of his poetry is in Persian, but he also composes qasidas in Arabic. He also includes a few token words here and there in Turkish and in Greek. And by the time of his son and his grandchildren, they're much more comfortable writing in Turkish than they are in Persian. So I think we just want to also preserve that commonality as a model. This is an academic point, since you are such a promising scholar. One of my own personal pet peeves, and to the extent that if I were allowed to wage a nonviolent jihad in the academy, it would be to actually require of every Islamic studies student to be fluent in at least 2 Islamic languages. We follow the model of biblical studies, and we require of all of our students to be fluent in French or German, because that's what biblical studies was based on. I would much rather see our students be fluent in Arabic and Persian, Arabic and Turkish, Arabic and Urdu. I think Arabic has to be one, but then the other one would depend on the particular language that people are studying.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have another question in the audience from Zahara Gul.
Assalamu alaikum. Omid, thank you so much for your talk this evening. I absolutely love your work, and your book, Radical Love, was very much life-changing for me. What I wanted to ask was your translations that you did of the Quran in that book. That was the first time I've ever read an English translation of the Quran and actually felt like, wow, this is what Allah is saying to us. But when I listen to translations or read other Quranic translations, they always feel really rigid. And I just don't feel like they're communicating what God wants us to, believe, especially when it comes to the whole, nuances of women in Islam. So I would love to know if you would ever consider translating the Quran and publishing it. And if not, is there a translation of the Quran that you would recommend?
Thank you so very, very much. That's very kind of you. And if I may combine this question on translation with the one that Ibrahim had asked previously. Life is so very short, and so am I. So the translating of the whole Quran is perhaps something that I'm not qualified to do. But what I have done, and I hope to spend more time doing this, inshallah, is I'll put up a little link to it here, is, I do have these online series of classes, and there's one that I have that's called The Heart of the Quran. And so this is based on a book that Imam Ghazali wrote, the Jawahir al-Quran, the Jewels of the Quran, in which he's very openly talking about the fact that not all the verses of the Quran have the identical spiritual value, and that some verses are merely legal. About the example he gives is of inheritance. And then he says there's other verses like Ayatul Kursi and Ayatul Nur, which are just luminous. And so what I did in this Heart of the Quran course, and that's open to anybody, is I chose, I think, 14 of the ayahs of the Quran, and then I tried to approach them the way that sages like Maulana Rumi and Ibn Arabi and Ahmad Ghazali and Sam'ani and Attar and others have done. So that's one option. Personally, especially I think for people who are looking to grow deeper in their faith, I do not find the reading the Quran cover to cover to be the most beautiful approach. It may work for some people. I'm not persuaded that it does for many people. And my suggestion is always to approach it in two ways. To first of all, read something like Martin Lings's book on the Prophet, and then look at the particular verses of the Quran in the context of what was happening in the Prophet's life at that time. So it's kind of doing for yourself a sort of asbab al-nuzul, the occasions of revelation type of an exercise. And then the other one is, we all know the verses of the Quran that attract the great deal of attention. And some of them are even known today by chapter and verse, something which no Muslim 100 years ago would have ever done. But now we all know 434 for understandable reasons. And I think it's very helpful to pick some of these sages who are such a wonderful gateway towards the world of divine mercy and love and compassion. Maulana Rumi is the one that my own heart answers to, but it could be that for somebody else, it's Ibn Arabi or somebody else. And then take a look at which verses of the Quran are they coming back to, and how are they approaching it? How are they interpreting it? There's a friend of ours, Shahab Ahmed, who passed away, may God have mercy on him, at a very young age. And he wrote this exquisite book, What is Islam? It might be one of the most bold books written in Islamic studies in the last 40 years. And he makes the claim that outside of a madrasa context, no book shaped the understanding of Muslims' understanding of the Quran as much as Rumi's Masnavi did. When you take a look at how many thousands of copies of the Masnavi we have, it just dwarfs almost any other text that we have in our tradition. So I think that's one place that one could turn to. And just very briefly to go back to Ibrahim's question about translations of Rumi, Nicholson's translation, I'm writing a book at this point about the reception of Rumi in later scholarship. Nicholson's translation remains the only complete English translation. Javed Mujaddidi, who is an Afghan-British scholar now living in America, he has gone through 4 out of the 6 volumes of Rumi's Masnavi. and inshallah in another decade or so he'll finish it. It takes about 30 years of just staying devoted to that task to finish just translating the Masnavi, and he's doing it as rhymed translation. Alan Williams is doing it as a prose translation, and in that same format that we have, which is the Illuminated Courses. We also do have a course on Rumi's poetry. I'll put the link maybe in there, and that's available again to anyone. So this one is called The Heart of Rumi's Poetry, and it takes you through the stories of the Masnavi, pausing to point out the Quranic references, the Hadith references, the stories from the earlier sages, and essentially kind of walks you in a very gentle way through it. So that's the heart of Rumi's poetry, which I would recommend to people, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Professor. And lastly, we have a question from Reem Iskandar.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting and subject for me and for everybody. I'm sure I am in no way or shape related to this study, but I always was interested in Sufism, and my passion of knowing more about this method and of handling Islamic beliefs and dealing with it. I'm always was a spiritual person, and I'm leaning to their way of practicing religion. And my question to you, what do you recommend? Where to start about knowing more about this doctrine? What books, translations of some kind in English or in Arabic? I speak Arabic too. I would appreciate that a great deal, and I would love to hear more and more and have more, listen more to lectures from you. This is an enrichment, and I'm so happy and glad that the University of Houston is reaching out to far and near people and that are enriching the American and all kind of people about different cultures and other aspects about the Islamic religion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let me, if I may, offer a few kind of resources. So, there are some people who benefit very much from reading books. And, we're many of us are nerds. Some people call us intellectuals, but let's be honest, we are nerds. Let's admit and take pleasure in it. And so there is something to be said about reading books. And I certainly count myself blessed to be able to spend a lot of my life in studying these classical and medieval teachings and try to figure out how to convey them in a new language. I did put together, and I'm going to put it in the chat line, a Twitter roll of resources in English that are accessible, and these are books that are easily available. So I put that in the chat line. Having said that, remember that the Sufis have always emphasized that books are necessary, but it's also necessary to combine that with person-to-person, face-to-face, heart-to-heart fellowship and companionship. And that doesn't have to mean necessarily having a sheikh or a sheikha, but having people around who can make the journey not be a solitary one, but that you have some sense of community. Maybe for Hazrat Ibrahim, he could be a millah unto himself, as the Quran says, but the rest of us can use some sense of community. I think in this day and age, one wants to be extraordinarily careful and cautious about the people who call themselves a sheikh. There's just so many abuses and scandals, sexually, monetary, in terms of authority, I would always urge people to be cautious about people who portray themselves as somehow being ma'soom, being sinless and immaculate. And I think if you come across a situation in which people are presenting things in that way, you might want to approach it with a very healthy dose of skepticism. The question is always, and if in the Bible we're told that through Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, you shall know them by their fruit. I think the question that you want to be asking is, do you come closer to God? Do you come closer to the Prophet? Do you come closer to living in that state of presence through reading a particular book, engaging in a particular practice, being with a specific teacher or community? Other than the book that I mentioned there, I'll extend an invitation. We do have some monthly gatherings that are online. They're open to anybody, and there's a little bit of sharing of teachings from the Sufi tradition, chance to spend some time in fellowship with people, and then very simple zikrs that people can take with them for the next month. And so if you go to the link that I just put on there, you will see something called Chai, Love, and Prayer. So that's a monthly gathering that we have. And so I think, may that inshallah be helpful. And just very lastly, as we're wrapping things up in terms of what Maha just posted online, in terms of response to people who might say that, isn't some of this language potentially scandalous, potentially problematic? Part of it is to remember that language is so rich, and especially the languages of our traditions, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Turkish, Wolof. These are languages which are poetic languages. There was a deep understanding of metaphor as always being a bridge that leads you over to its inner meaning. And in some ways, our understandings today have become quite flat. So, it's not just that, those hadiths of the Prophet introduce Rahman and Rahim as coming from or being cognate related to the words for Rahim. It's that when the sages are commenting on it, someone like Ibn Arabi introduces it by saying, it's as if. It's as if, right? So this is not a language of a scientific manual. This is not even the language of kalam or of fiqh. It is that imaginative language. It is that poetic language. And I do think recovering that poetic language and the faculty of reasoning in a poetic way, experiencing God and reality in a poetic way, is an extraordinarily important lesson for us and for our community today.
On that wonderful note, thank you so much, Professor Safi, for this truly engaging and illuminating talk. Thank you very much to Professor Jihan Yüksel for her excellent introduction that situated your work in the context of the field. And thank you to Professor Badawi for his commentary, which helped us understand your work from angles that probably us non-specialists wouldn't have been able to arrive at. Now, above all, I'd like to thank our audience. There's been a lot of interest in this talk, Professor Safi. We had a large crowd. They asked engaging questions. In fact, there are more questions that we received than we can accommodate. But I hope that they will be able to contact you through other means and attend your talks and read your books. So thank you for honoring us with this visit, and hopefully we will be able to host you in person next time. Thank you so much. everyone, and have a beautiful, beautiful day.
Thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.